Hello friends, this is self-critical Automaton, one of many citizens who never looks up, missing out on an entire world of illicit rooftop shenanigans. And, so I finished my Mirror's Edge playthrough, but I wanted to have a final short bonus episode to talk about a bunch of things that I wanted to bring up, but didn't. So, first off I want to show off a handful of things, and then we'll head over to the extras to view some concept art, which I think is neat and worth talking about. So, let's jump right in to me showing off a couple of neat things that exist in the game. So this first one is just an Easter egg. There's a neat little thing. If you are falling through the air and you use the spin 180, you fall backwards. If you then also pull the attack button, you flip two fingers in the air. If you do it as you go past a cop, you actually get an achievement for basically flipping off a cop, which I think is neat. Next up we actually have two glitches, which are both used as speedrunning tech. I stumbled across them accidentally myself, before later discovering that they were well known in the speedrunning community for obvious reasons. But I'm pretty sure that they work on the same concept, which is that I don't think this game really ties your falling damage. Just to explain this one, if you stand on this edge here, on this very corner, then when this drops, you are completely fine. It just drops, and you're fine. So, falling damage isn't tied to, for example, you moving fast enough to take damage like it would in real life. It's probably tied to your animation state. So, because the object is what falls rather than you don't jump off an edge, you don't run off an edge, you never actually are falling as far as the game is concerned, so you just move downwards vertically. The same thing happens here in the train tunnel, except that you're moving horizontally rather than vertically. Because the object is what's moving and you aren't, there is no kind of impact damage. There's not even an animation for it, really, when in a moment we will be gently scraped off the edge. This is obviously used to get off the train faster in speedruns. It's a pretty clever trick if you can manage it, because it saves you from shattering both of your shin bones. So now I want to jump into the unlockables section, which features, I think I showed this off in episode 1, but it features a concept art gallery, a variety of videos, and a music player. A lot of games way long ago, console games primarily, had a sound test mode, and you could leave it running to play various bits of music from the game. I used to do that as a kid while I was working on things. Just have my console running in the background. So I'm going to put one of my favourite bits on in the background, which, let's go with Shard Puzzle. Nope, Cape Puzzle? That's the one. So, yeah, I'm not going to watch any of the videos, but what it features is the Attract movie, which was used for some of the early marketing materials, and is basically the first thing I saw before the game ever even came out, and I just immediately fell in love with this setting. And this idea, this primarily not combat related game about running and jumping in first person and in this beautifully designed city. The rest of these are the chapter intro movies, which have come in very handy for me while stitching these videos together. So there is a ton of content from this game. There was a lot that was changed during development, so obviously, first off, Faith wasn't intended to be the protagonist. It was kind of supposed to be an ensemble cast, and there's a lot of remnants of that featured in the game. There's a lot of, interesting designs who only show up very briefly, or they gesture a lot at a wider world that is not actually seen. These underground networks of the runners. It's also worth noting that Faith was actually originally intended to have a gun that was your gun, that you just kept all of the time. Which maybe implies that an earlier version of the game was even more of a shooter than the actual final version. These I think are the final concepts for Faith as she would appear in the game, although as you can see she still has a gun. I think that's like a Glock 17 or something. So it went from a much more sort of generic blob to an actual finalised design. These pieces were used for magazine covers, as it says. So In addition to like a handful of cut objects such as a gas mask and a cell phone, which still exist in the game files but never appear in the game because they never actually showed up, you can infer some things about the original plot. And I think the developers in an interview somewhere said that the plot of the game was originally much more related to how it seemed like it was going to be related when you play the start of this game. When you hear about this game, you hear that it's a game about doing parkour in like a... It's often called cyberpunk, but it's not really. Cityscape, trying to deliver packages across rooftops. But it's really not. You do that in the first chapter, and that's the only time you ever deliver a package. Well, in the original version of the game's plot, it was going to be much more about actually delivering these packages. Whether that means, you know, the contents of a package is important to a plot in some way, or whether, you know, it's something you do repeatedly as part of the ongoing plot in a more broad sense, is nobody knows. But I still think it's interesting to bring up. This is actually, what it says is that it's magazine art that was then reused for packaging, and this is actually part of the packaging for the game's cover, basically. I love how much focus there is on her as the character, for a game that could be considered very detached from character, because it's first person the whole time. So I think it's impressive that they managed to maintain such a clear character for Faith, despite the fact that protagonists like that tend to be used only as a cipher for the player, rather than as an actual person in their own right. Whenever I look at images like this, it reminds me of me a decade ago when my strongest desire in life was to become a concept artist. And that never really went away, even though as my mental health completely collapsed, I was unable to pursue that dream any further. That desire never really went away, and I still have a vague little hope deep inside me that one day I'll be a concept painter. So, who knows? Maybe I'll achieve that, but probably not, let's be honest. They're also not actually featured here anywhere, I don't think, but an earlier version of the game featured grenades, which were removed on the grounds that it would be too powerful to let the player use them, since, you know, you're supposed to be running in fear from the cops most of the time. But it would also be kind of, not out of character exactly, but too damaging to the city, that, you know, ordinary street police would be armed with grenades. Which is a bit of a stretch, given that they do just casually machine gun skyscrapers all the way through this game. Anyway, this is the concept for the train station, which features in, I think, the third or fourth chapter, which is amusing to me because this reminds me most of all of some of the London Underground stations. It doesn't feel American in flavour to me. But that's really based on nothing at all. So I think this is the only featured art of a level that was not actually put in the game. It might have been semi-built and then just cut from the game, or it might not have got past the concept stage, I don't know. But it's reasonable to infer that maybe this chapter set in a prison would have been about rescuing Kate, rather than the convoy ambush that's featured in the final game. There's something beautiful about the kind of broad strokes, blocky impressionism used in a lot of concept art styles. I've always been completely in love with it. I have a whole shelf full of art books with concept art from various different games, movies and so on. I think there's something really wonderful about it, the way it varies layers of detail and can show so much with so little in some instances. There's a couple of other things I wanted to bring up. One is that they didn't just cut that one level, they also cut a couple boss fights. In the final episode I talk about the longer version of the final boss fight that was supposed to be in the game but got removed. But there were actually 2 boss fights removed, because you were supposed to have a much longer boss fight with rope burn earlier on in the game, which was swapped out for that I think I called it a puzzle boss, but it's not really, it's just a QTE cutscene. But I actually think that removing combat-based boss fights from the game was a good idea. I actually think that the fight with the pursuit cop, who turns out to be Celeste, is actually one of the weaker components of the game, and I think that removing more complex fights for in favour of, you know, puzzle bosses is actually the right decision for the style of game and the tone of this game and what you do in this game. As you can see, Celeste went through quite a few different designs before they settled on her. Her early designs are much more punk-like, but I kind of admire that they went for the very sleek sports lesbian vibe that they ended up with. The patrol cop. Honestly, he's so satisfying to kick in the face. It's something about how he... I might be reading a lot into this, but this looks like the kind of man who thinks he's the cool guy, but really isn't. The Riot Cop is interesting because he actually got modelled and coded and added to the game. I don't think they ever gave him AI, but a Riot Cop model and Riot Shield exist in the game files, and modders can bring those dummied out files to the surface and interact with them. So the police Riot Shield you were supposed to actually be able to take away and use as a weapon yourself. Jackknife's design changed quite a lot. But I love this kind of 90s male model version, which is a lot closer to how it ended up in the final game. There was actually a DLC pack for this game. Oh, also, Merc's name... When I first played this, I just assumed that his name was short for mercenary, since that made the most sense for a guy who, you know, is the heart of a network of criminal underground organisers. But it's actually short for Mercury, which I actually really like a lot more because he... this is a game about running and speed, and most of all, passing on messages. Or at least, theoretically, that's what it is. As I said, the plot where you do pass on messages was removed. But Mercury, of course, is the god of messengers, so I like that as a nice little reference. There's something about the early designs of Miller that just looks like Hugo Weaving to me. He doesn't look like Hugo Weaving, his face is different, but there's something about... It's just something about him that evokes the same attitude. I always assumed that Ropeburn's teeth were actually supposed to just be yellow, and I never really understood why. It's not until I looked through this gallery that I discovered, oh, he's supposed to have gold teeth. Like he's got that kind of gaudy stuff going on. The Riot Cops kind of made it into the game just as they are, really. There's not much difference between these early designs and the designs in the game. The only difference between here is really the gauntlets. Same again here, no gauntlets and no chestplate. I'm very glad they didn't go with the incredibly goofy design on the right for the Pursuit Cops, though, because I think that the understated, like, baseball catcher's cage face mask thing, it works a lot better. So I think I was mentioning that there was a DLC pack for this game, which actually featured a whole bunch of blocks moving in space. It was completely abstract. You still play as Faith, but it's a set of time trials on these... It's almost like a Super Mario 3D platformer level. These large shapes and rectangles moving through space. So there was always this intention... This is an aside, or rather it's going back to what I was saying after that aside. But there was always this intention to have a wider group of figures and like a nice, wide, diverse roster of characters, which probably would have played into the earlier version of the game with the more like episodic messenger-based plot. Also, yeah, Merc's house is a cooling tower on top of one of these buildings. It's not just like a weird pod. Again, very much this classical... I call it classical because it's this sort of archetypical concept art style. These kind of broad brushstroke digital paintings. The bag, actually, in earlier versions of the game, it wasn't just more important as part of the story, but you could use it as a weapon in emergencies. You could hit cops with it. Some first-person concepting that seems like it would be related to the prison level. And of course those fucking servers that are a pain in the arse towards the end of the final chapter. Something I love about the texture, due to, you know, the way they combine layers of different opacities and so on in these kinds of paintings, is that the world as presented in these paintings is actually even grimier than the real in-game world, which is so much cleaner almost everywhere, even the areas that are intended to be less clean. There's also several paintings here which are details of the various paintings in the game, but unfortunately they've picked 3 of the most boring ones. I do really love these abstract paintings, and I think a lot of the abstracts on the walls of the various offices in the game are really nice. I just think that these are 3 of the least interesting ones. Finally, there's actually some hints that there might have been multiplayer planned for this game. There's not just the wider roster of characters that who end up actually showing up in the game. There's also the fact that there are actually first-person animations in the game, not just for Faith, but for Mercury, Jackknife, Celeste, Pursuit Cop, Celeste, and the generic Pursuit Cops. So that's another hint that there might have been a planned but cut multiplayer mode, because there's really no reason to program in those animations unless you're going to be playing as multiple characters, and it seems like even from early versions of the game it was intended to have one singular protagonist. As another aside related to that, you can actually detach the camera in-game and watch in the third person the animations of Faith running around, which is very, very goofy. In a first-person game, you often don't need to render the entire character's body, so, you know, you might just be legs from the knees down and a floating gun if you look at yourself from the outside. However, in this game, because so much of your body is visible to yourself, they did actually animate her entire body. I love these more sketchy paintings as well. But because you were never meant to see it from the outside, the animations are designed to look good from the first-person perspective, not the third-person perspective, which means that she kind of sprints in a very gangly, strange fashion with all knees and elbows poking out at odd angles. And so yeah, that is going to be all for today, I think. That's pretty much everything left that I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this little bonus episode. I'm sorry it's not as long as a full one, but join me next time when I will be starting Transistor, a very beautiful and interesting game. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.